All right, hey, what's up, everyone? So this little presentation is sort of a recap for the ACAT and the plant science portion of that. So that's kind of broken up into these four different sections, and we'll just kind of go over those a little bit, kind of refresh your memory, maybe from plant science. Maybe some of you had me, or maybe some of you had Dr. Mahan. All right. So when we're thinking about like just crop production in general, remember that we need at least four things in order for our plants to grow. There are some other things that come into play as well, but I think that these are pretty much the essentials in that. Remember, we have these growing degree days, and that most growth is dependent upon temperature. In general, it's dependent upon temperature. And so we also need light in that we have photosynthesis. And remember that that is where the plant absorbs that light energy and then converts that into carbohydrates in order to grow and produce that root system. And remember that the greater the roots, the greater the shoots, the greater the shoots, the greater the roots. And also that photo period is going to trigger that flowering. So remember that we have long day and short day, and that's actually a function of night length. I think maybe they have that a little backwards sometimes, but that as the days become longer, the nights become shorter, and that as the days become shorter, the nights become longer. And so currently we're headed into long day because the nights are getting shorter. We need water. Every living thing in general needs water in order to live. And so plants are about 75% water, and the rest is the actual like material, the dry matter yield that we're going to get from this plant. In general, that's made up of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, and about 10% of some other things. And so that other compound is going to be things like plant hormones or minerals like remember C. Hopkins Cafe, managed by mine cousin Mokel Nina. So that 10% other compounds is really like the lignin, the fats, the carbohydrates that make up the plant that we're actually growing, generally growing crops that we're growing them for food, right? I'm not taking into account like horticulture crops. We're talking about food crops here. And then we need carbon dioxide and oxygen because that is important for photosynthesis and respiration. Remember that plants breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen, which is beneficial for us because we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. So we have this sort of mutualistic relationship with our plant populations. A little bit about soils, as I mentioned, we've got our C. Hopkins Cafe, managed by mine cousin Mokel Nina, and most of those elements are going to be, available to the plant in some plant available form, somewhere in between about pH 6, pH 6.5, pH 7. Certain crops are going to have a little different variation in that, but in general, if your pH is between 6 and 6.5, then you're also going to get most of your nutrients be available to that plant so that they can take that up. It's also where we're going to store the water. And so remember that we're going to have this water and we're going to have these nutrients that are inside of that water, and we call that the soil solution, and that our roots are going to take up that water. It's going to have those minerals in it. It's going to go up the xylem to the leaves to perform correct photosynthesis. And that photosynthesis is going to make carbohydrates that are going to go down the phloem to the roots, and that is going to make the roots grow bigger. If the roots grow bigger, they can take up more water, more minerals, go up to the shoots, make the shoots bigger. They can perform more photosynthesis to make those carbohydrates. So we need to have this circulating system. And remember that our roots and our shoots are kind of dependent upon each other. One of the problems is that we can also have it can also store things like pathogens and insects. And so to kind of get around that, we can do hydroponics, and we use this soilless media. So, maybe you've had Dr. Pierce or Dr. Earhart, and y'all did like plant propagation, and we had this media mix, and that in general, not like perfectly, but in general, it is going to be a little more sterile than our native soil because it has not been exposed to other pathogens. And we kind of keep that separated, or at least apart from, or the potential for being exposed to any pathogens and insects. Now, once we plant those plants, like let's say this is in a greenhouse environment, once we plant those plants into the greenhouse and then they get infected, it's not sterile anymore. But in general, to start off with, hydroponics minimize that potential for pathogens and insects. So there are a lot of plant species, and about 350,000, but less than 20 of them are produced for the majority of the global food supply. And when we're talking about like the majority of the global food supply, we're talking about things like corn, rice, wheat, soybean, peanuts, tomatoes, things like that. So there are other crops that do get used for like food supply, like bananas, but the majority, like the big players, when I think about like the big ones, less than 20 are produced for food. And those fall into two categories. We have grasses and legumes. And so our cereal crops, remember, are grown for edible seed. That's why we're growing those. And when I think about like cereal crops for like edible seed, like corn is the first one that comes to my mind. Like each one of those kernels is a seed, obviously. And then we have like legumes and soybeans and peanuts are two like immediate examples of legumes that we're growing for food supply. And remember that our legumes have this special potential. They have this special mechanism where they can fix atmospheric nitrogen. And this is important because now we're not as dependent on our nitrogen fertilizers. And so sometimes we'll put like a legume cover crop out because we know that it's going to fix that atmospheric nitrogen. And when it decomposes, it's going to add that nitrogen back to the soil. So grasses and legumes are going to be the two major categories that these that these 15 to 20 crops fall into, those two categories. So when we're thinking about forages, for my animal science people, we've got things like tall fescue and annual ryegrass and orchard grass, and there might be some other ones, Kentucky bluegrass, etc. But these are going to be our main grasses that we grow for our forages. For our legumes, things like alfalfa or clover, and there's a ton of different types of clover. And one thing that probably we don't think about or have not done much research on is going to be perennial peanut. I think that's kind of interesting. My major professor was working on some things with perennial peanut to add into that principal forage crop. And remember that these are going to fix nitrogen. So if you're trying to increase your nitrogen content in your feed source, having these legumes in your pasture system are going to benefit your animals in that remember that nitrogen is part of an amino acid, and that amino acids make proteins, and that proteins make muscle. And that is what we're actually raising our animals for, is to increase that muscle mass. We also have like these three different categories, in that annuals need to be planted every year or annually. And some of those for our, you can see what we have for summer and winter. Summer being, corn and soybean, winter being something like wheats or oats. But our perennials, they only need to be planted once, in that these are probably going to be closer to our horticulture crops, in that we can plant those once and they'll continue to reproduce or continue to, their growth cycle every year. So something like cotton or maybe iris. And then finally, we have biennials, in that it takes 2 years for that crop to produce a bloom that is going to eventually produce some sort of fruit or something that we can harvest. So carrots are the first thing that I think about when I'm thinking about biennials. So we mentioned earlier about our temperature, and we've got our plant hardiness zones, and we've got long day and short day and day neutral. And this is really kind of what goes into our how we grow and where we grow our plants, in that not only is temperature a problem, like North Dakota. I would never want to live in North Dakota because it gets too cold for too long. And then also there's this like day length is a little bit different, maybe in Michigan compared to Florida, and that's got something to do with the curvature of the earth and the tilt of the axis and whatnot. But if we want to increase the hardiness, we would want our plants to be able to process more photosynthate. And that was going to be important in that, like the nighttime, like when we talk about long day and short day, the nighttime is where that plant processes those photosynthase. And so that's where it sort of metabolizes the food. I'm doing my air quote thing, the food that it's making when it's performing photosynthesis during the daytime. And so if we get a longer night period, then we can process more photosynthetes and we can increase the hardiness. That plant actually gets stronger and can adapt to the environment a little bit better. So something to pay attention for there in the future, as you know, we start to have these changes in climate, that in order to increase the hardiness, we've got to increase the food source and be efficient with that. So being able to process more photosynthetes is going to increase the plant hardiness. Probably something that at least the animal sciences probably never encountered was like this thing about landscapes. And so landscapes, like we look around and everything looks pretty and everything, but there's actually an art and kind of a science to it. In that, which one of these is going to be more visually appealing? Well, naturally the one on the top, right? Because there's these different colors and these contrasts, and it's pretty and it's sort of calming. Now there's nothing wrong with the ones on the bottom, in that there is just sort of this at least on the left, it's just consistent, but it's the color that is actually what's important when we're thinking about landscapes, because it's what pops. It's what makes you go, oh, look. The picture on the left just kind of makes you kind of go, oh, okay, it's just trees. When we're looking at like a landscape and overall, right? Like just in general, a landscape is composed of, it's going to be the trees and the shrubs, and we're going to have a lawn. What's important is the color, because that's going to give us the contrast. Trees are the most important feature of this, in that they're going to give this sort of breaking up of the background, and your eyes are going to be drawn to those, and then everything underneath is going to kind of flow with that. And so your yard or the lawn area is what's going to tie everything together. So we've got color. Oh, give me that back. Color is most important as far as like when we're designing it. Trees are going to be the most important feature inside of that. Like we want to make sure that we're looking at those trees, and we're going to pick trees that have different colors. One thing about Tennessee that's really great is that there are several different colors that come. From Mississippi, we get like brown, and that's about it. So we got color. Trees are going to be the most important feature, and then the lawn is going to tie everything together, because it's probably going to be kind of the centerpiece of that, and you want everything around it to have this inviting sort of like you're leading up to that house. Maybe you look at something more in an urban area. Look, we've got this great color with these trees. These are going to be things like maples are going to give you a lot of good color. The trees are the most important feature, and so you want to have these contrasts. We've got some evergreens here. We've got some orange trees. I don't really know exactly what kind of trees these are, but you see they have this nice bright color. I'm going to guess that they're going to be maples of some sort. And then in the foreground, or kind of up front, we've got this color and this contrast that goes from orange, and we've got purples and yellows. Purple and yellow go really well together, don't they? And then we've got the lawn that ties everything together. And so that's going to kind of bring everything in this centerpiece around the house that sort of gives it this, I don't know, man, kind of like a majestic feel almost, in that it's like inviting, and you want to walk up to this thing. And then as you walk into the house, you feel right at home. All right. Moving into the pesticide portion of this, in that we need to think about, and when we say pesticides, we mean things like herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. because all of those can be crop pests. And so we had this thing called an economic threshold, in that when we reach this economic threshold, you are likely to have a decrease in yield. That at some point in time, if you get above this limit right here, that you're going to experience a decrease in yield, which is going to hurt your pocketbook. So the things that we can do to that are going to be, we can either spray a pesticide before the problem starts to exist. And we call this avoidance, in that we don't ever want to run into this issue. And it might be that you have the funding for this, and you can do that because you know that you're going to save money on the back end, because you'll never have this pest problem. Next, we've got protection, in that when we see this risk, whether it be an insect or whether it be a weed, or we start to see this pathogen, we start to see this fungus growing on our plant, we identify that and we go, uh-oh, I have a problem. I need to spray something now. So next we have eradication. And so it might be that maybe in a greenhouse situation that you want to completely just remove all of those plants from that environment because you don't want to infect other plants. This can also be that you want to spray something that is very strong, such as maybe in a pasture situation, excuse me, it can be like gramoxone, in that you're going to kill just about everything except for the grass that you're growing, because you don't want to have that problem anymore. So we have avoidance before the problem exists. We have protection when the problem is present. And then finally, eradication. We want to completely get rid of the problem. So economic threshold, at some point, we're going to run into a yield reduction because of this pathogen, this pest, this weed, this insect. And we have three options. We can either make sure that the problem never exists. We can wait until the problem exists and spray only when that problem is there, because why spray something if the problem is not there? And then we can completely remove that threat. When we think about the way that we're going to actually get rid of this, we have this absorption, or the way that the chemical, whatever the chemical is, attacks or kills this plant or insect problem. And so we have contact, in that when this comes into contact with, whether I'm going to think about like plants and weeds, in that you can spray a herbicide on a plant, and when it comes into contact, it will kill that plant like where you spray that herbicide, like just in the location. So that would mean that you need to get full coverage over this plant in order to kill everything. And it's possible that we miss some. Otherwise, what we really want to apply is a systemic. And the thing about this systemic herbicide, or it can be an insecticide too, or fungicide actually, in that chemical gets on the plant, it gets absorbed into the plant, and then it's translocated throughout the plant by the xylem and the phloem. And so this is sort of, it covers everything, in that you're essentially going to get this chemical into all parts of the plant, or it could be all parts of the insect, or it could be all parts of the pathogen. But in general, it's going to be in the plant via the xylem or the phloem, so that if you have a weed, you're going to get translocation into the shoots and the roots. If it's an insect, you're going to get this absorption into the plant, so that no matter where that insect is, if it's eating on that plant, it will kill it. One of the biggest issues with our pesticides is going to be drift. And man, you can get in a lot of trouble with if you spray a pesticide and it gets on someone else's plants. I think in a landscape situation, the first thing I think of is if you spray Roundup and it gets on roses and you kill someone else's, prized winning, or, prized possession roses. In a crop situation, if you spray dicamba and it gets on someone else's crop that might not be dicamba resistant, there can be some damage done there too. And so this is going to be influenced by at least three things: the sprayer pressure. And I mean, man, when we think about pressure, this could be that like a water hose. In that, the more pressure, the the stronger the output. The nozzle size, and you want to really actually have a more heavy droplet so that it falls to the plant or it falls onto the ground. And then finally, wind speed, obviously, right? Because if there's no wind, well, then everything's just going to settle to the ground. But if you're spraying and there's wind, um, that's going to be a big issue in that you can't really stop where the drift happens, and it can just be random wherever that wind takes that. So something that you want to do when you're thinking about like spraying any kind of pesticide is like the time of day when you're going to spray that. Typically you want to do that early in the morning. um, and when I say early in the morning, I don't mean getting up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and going out and spraying. I mean at like 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, when the sun's starting to come up, and then that dew is going to sort of um, evaporate off of the plant, and the wind is low, because that's all driven by temperature. And so you wouldn't want to spray something at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because likely the wind speed is going to be high. We can have this problem with volatilization, and the best way to combat that is to get that into the soil or onto the plant as quickly as possible. And so that's why we want to do this early in the morning, because volatilization is also going to be influenced by temperature. One of the problems with spraying pesticides is that you might end up killing some beneficial insects. So you definitely don't want to be spraying any insecticide during the flowering stage, because you're going to be killing some bees, right? And that's really a big issue that we have, in at least in agriculture, is that they're sort of pointing the finger and saying, "Oh, you're spraying all these chemicals that are killing all the bees," and that's because people see another problem, and they're wanting to fix that immediately, and so they spray an insecticide that is going to kill everything. So man, if you start killing your insects, then you start killing your crops, because now they're not going to they're not going to be pollinated. Another problem is that you could develop resistance, and so you need to use alternate modes of action. And maybe you haven't had a weed science class, or maybe it was or wasn't talked about in forages, but there are these different modes of action and the way that this chemical kills either the plants or the insects. And if you spray that too much, eventually they're going to develop resistance, right? The plant or the animals, the plant or the insect is going to get stronger because it's been exposed to that. One of the biggest ones that we have an issue with is Roundup, in that we've been spraying Roundup on crops. In 1996, they came up with Roundup Ready soybean, and then we've got Roundup Ready cotton and corn, and we keep spraying these over and over and over again. Farm producers put it in every spray tank that they make. They're like, just throw some Roundup in there. And they're kind of defeating the purpose now, because all they're doing is just creating more resistance. And so, like I said, time of day, in the early morning, you're going to have low wind, or at least a lower wind, and that's not going to impact drift as much. Yay, math, woohoo! All right, let's look at some things here. So we've got this insecticide that is 50% pure. This is the analysis. If you've had me for any class, you know that my favorite equation is rate over analysis, because it applies in so many different areas. So let's find out what the rate needs to be. Our rate, we are going to need 20 pounds of active ingredient. Okay, and we found this because we took 400 pounds times 5% insecticidal value. So we are trying to make something that has an analysis of 5%. So in order for this 400-pound mixture to have a 5% insecticidal value or active ingredient, we need 20 pounds of this material. This material here, we need 20 pounds of. So once we figure out how much we need, what the rate is, we're going to divide the rate by the analysis. And we got this analysis from right here. So rate over analysis means that in this, we need to have 40 pounds of this material. And think about this, 40 times 0.5 gives us the 20. All right, so first thing we're going to find out is how many pounds we have, what we need it to be, 400 times 0.05 gives us 20 pounds needed. Now, how do we get that? Rate over the analysis. So 20 pounds needed divided by the 50% of this insecticidal value or the active ingredient. This material is 50% pure, so we need twice as much. Therefore, we would need 20 times 2. All right, let's look at another example. So we know that we need a 100-pound mixture that needs to have an analysis of 12%. So 100 times 12 gives us 12 pounds of active ingredient needed. Then we're going to do rate over analysis. So 12 pounds needed divided by the 30%, the active ingredient right here, 30%, gives us another, well, it just so happens that it's going to be 40 pounds of this insecticide needed. So 100 pounds, what you want, 12% insecticidal value, gives us 100 times 0.12, 12 pounds active ingredient. This is now our new rate. We need 12 pounds inside of this 100-pound mixture. The rate over the analysis, 12 pounds needed, divided by 0.3, means 40 pounds of insecticide needed. So that's going to be 60 pounds of flour and 40 pounds of insecticide. Following that? Okay. All right, let's move into plant metabolism. In that, for our animal scientists, this is where those carbohydrates and fats and proteins are going to be created, and how they're going to be created is important for us because that's why we're growing them. And so having a better understanding of photosynthesis is going to help us produce our crops better. So both animals and plants, both animals and humans need plants in order for their energy. And so they're going to make at least, mostly, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And so we're going to get our carbohydrates from things like corn or maybe rice. We're going to get fats and proteins from things like soybean. And then we've also got some different vitamins. And there's obviously more vitamins that are created by these plants, or at least, produced. But the main ones are going to be A, B, and C. In that our green leafy vegetables, so something like spinach, is going to provide us with vitamin A. Our legumes are going to provide us with vitamin B. And then finally, our vitamin C is going to come from citrus fruit, right? Our oranges, our grapefruit, our little tangerines, our little cuties, whatever, lemons even. So we've got carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. We've got these different vitamins that are mostly important, like these green leafy vegetables for vitamin A. Legumes are going to give us vitamin B. And then our citrus fruits, C for citrus, are going to give us vitamin C. Oh, we have these different plant hormones that sort of give us these processes that happen in order for our plants to grow throughout all the different stages from seed dormancy, meaning that if there's high abscisic acid, that our plants are going to remain dormant. And once that gets metabolized, our seeds come out of dormancy. We have our auxins, which are a plant growth regulator. And this is the first hormone that was ever, like the first plant hormone that was identified. They finally found that plants are growing when they're exposed to this chemical. And we use this auxin. Actually, it's one of the most common ones as far as for our like 2,4-D, in that if you spray this auxin on a plant, you're forcing it to grow faster than it can. So it's almost going to outgrow itself, and then it will die because it can't keep up. Next, we have things like cytokinins. We have ethylene. Ethylene is for like fruit ripening. Uh, in that, let's say that you have a lot of bananas that you're trying to get ripe really quick, you can apply the ethylene gas, and that is going to make those ripen faster. And then gibberellins. And so this is part of germination. And so if we have seed dormancy and germination, those two are likely going to have some balance. But what's most important is this auxin one, in that it was the first hormone that was identified. Our metabolism, photosynthesis, is going to be light energy converted into chemically bonded energy. And so the formula for that is, 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water. So we need carbon dioxide and water in the presence of light and chlorophyll, because this is carbonated water essentially, right? But unless there's chlorophyll and light, we don't perform photosynthesis. And so that's going to end up making our sugars. And then in the output, or a byproduct of that, is going to be oxygen. And this happens in the chloroplast. Chlorophyll is inside of the chloroplast. We classify plants in 3 ways. We have C3 plants, C4 plants, and then CAM plants. And this C3 and C4 has to do with the carbon fixation, in that in C3 plants, we need rubisco to fix carbon dioxide to RUBP, which makes a 6 carbon molecule that splits into 2 3 carbon molecules. For our C4 plants, we're going to create a 4 carbon molecule that is then going to bring that into the bundle sheath cells. And then our CAM plants are things like cactus, in that it's so hot where they grow that they will open up their stomata at night and then perform the Calvin cycle during the day. So this is important. Like the reason why we're talking about this is because there's a distinct advantage between the C4 and the CAM plants. That because when the stomata open, we are going to, so the stomata will close, and if there's no carbon dioxide coming in, eventually we're using up all of this carbon off of this molecule, which means only oxygen is there. And in C3 plants, that oxygen can be fixed to RUBP. And remember that we have 1 carbon plus a 5 carbon molecule to make 6 carbons. And if we don't attach a carbon to that, we only make a 5 carbon molecule, and that's not efficient. So we're not going to make this sugar. We'll look at this in just a moment. RUBP fixes oxygen instead of carbon dioxide, which means we're not going to make as much sugar. So in here we have our regular C4 photosynthesis that carbon dioxide is going to come in. We're going to mix. That's going to be bound to this 5 carbon molecule. We're going to create 2 G3Ps. That's going to make our carbohydrate right here. This is our sugar. And then that's going to go back around. If we don't fix that carbon, we have photorespiration, in that this process is inefficient. It is spinning its wheels and not creating this sugar. Okay. What's most important for you on this exam is to understand that C3 plants are at a disadvantage because of photorespiration. So C4 plants don't have that problem, but C3 plants do. So C3, biggest thing right here is going to be this photorespiration. It occurs in C3 plants, but not in C4 plants. And all that is just that C4 and CAM plants have adapted so that they don't suffer that problem. But the biggest difference between C3 and C4 is that C3 are at a disadvantage because of photorespiration. All right, almost there, almost there. We got a little bit about genetics, and then this should end this, right? And so that, this is going back to Mendel, and the P in that if we have a cross, which is just a monohybrid cross, that we have only two alleles present. 2 times 2 is 4, and we get this output. This is, basic general genetics, in that when you cross these different alleles, you're going to have this combination that can be present. If we want to do a dihybrid cross, we're going to have 4 different alleles present. And when you cross 4 times 4, you get 16. So 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 4 is 16. And this just keeps on going if you're trying to figure out what the outcome is. And so there are these different outcomes for this, and we have this different sort of ratio that comes out. For this particular one, this ratio is always going to be the same. But I think it's most important to understand that if you're just crossing one allele for like yellow or green, then you're only going to get 4. If you have 2 alleles that you're looking for, so this is round yellow and wrinkled green, then you're going to have a different outcome. But there are 16 potential outcomes for that. 16 potential outcomes for that. How this happens is we're going to have this pollination. So as we talked about this before, that if you're in the flowering stage and you're going to, like, that you're about to have this pollination event, you don't want to be spraying your insecticides because you're likely to kill some bees. So what we have is we have this transfer of this pollen from the anther to the stigma that will grow down the pollen tube and finally have this fertilization inside of the ovule. Now, when it comes to pollination, there's a couple of different types, and it's important to understand which one is which. So we have, let me go back, self-pollination. So on the same flower, so something like this, and this is the same flower, it can be the same plant, but from a different flower, in that the genetic material is the same. This is the plant's own genetic material, and it will know that. There are certain mechanisms inside of the plant that can tell that it's its own DNA. And then we have cross-pollination, and this is where the bee has to land on this flower and that flower in order to fertilize that. And so if it bounces back and forth between these two flowers, then we get this pollination event. So either self-pollinated or cross-pollinated. And so some things for self-pollination are going to be things like wheat or barley. Are cross-pollinated. What we might not think about is apples. Apples are cross-pollinated in that, you definitely don't want to be spraying your insecticide on apples when you're expecting pollination. Things like corn, sunflower, and then something that can be either or, in that there are mechanisms that go, hey, you know what? It's getting too late in the growing season and I need to flower now, so I will take my own DNA and make this happen. But self-pollinated, likely going to be something like wheat. Cross-pollinated, we're thinking something like apples. And then either or, we're thinking something like cotton. All right. So that ends all of that. Man, I think I covered just about everything that you're going to see on this ACAT. Just kind of a general overview, right? And this mostly for my plant science people to kind of get a refresher, and then my animal sciences, at least to make you aware of some of this content. All right, that's all I got for today. Thank you so much for paying attention to that, and hopefully that jogs some memories.